Looks like it's about 180 degrees. Oh, sorry. I was just taking a bearing. Today, I think we really need to look into that age of discovery when Europeans set out across the globe in exploration to see what they could find. And why? And how? Because those are some of the big questions here. Um, we know they're out there. We know in the late 1300s, 1400s, that's when people started to head out. But that's not the first times Europeans really encountered others. Um, the Crusades from 1096 to 1204 brought Europeans in contact with North Africans, Middle Eastern, Persians, of course, and many other groups. More to the point, the expansion of the Mongolian Empire brought Europeans in direct contact with much of the other world. The opening of the Silk Road, which was a function of the Mongolian Empire controlling all the way from what we would now call Austria to the edges of Korea, allowed open trade and communication. Marco Polo, of course, very famously traveled all the way to China, lived there many years, and came back and wrote all about it. So people in the Middle Ages are gaining exposure to this. But, of course, in 1368, the East is closed. The Silk Road is closed, the Mongols kind of implode upon themselves, and no longer are Europeans having access to all of those items from China in the East that they once had. But how did they do it? And the how did they do it is really the story of this, of the plague, of the intensity of this age. We've referred to it in another episode where the 50% reduction in the population brought about kind of great inventions and changes to society. But the one people tend to forget about is the most radical. And it is this. It is the ugly pig of a ship called the Spanish caravel, or perhaps the Portuguese caravel. This is the great change that came to European society. Previous to the plague, ships, especially on the Mediterranean, were large galleys. Many rowers propelling a ship. Now, you can, when you're downwind, when the wind is behind you, you simply put up your sail and you go. When you go upwind, meaning into the wind, you have to row. By this time, the Islamic traders between India and Arabia were doing these small things called dhows, D-H-O-W, and you will see that in the top picture. What they developed are sails that were triangular and could be set to sail into the wind and skim off the wind at about 45 degrees, much like a modern sailing ship. They had just begun among the Italians to start to developing a ship like that. You see in the lower corner there, it's a thing called a nef. They adapted that Islamic Indian sail, and they had started calling it the Latin sail after the Latins. They thought the Italians had kind of constructed them. And when these things were very slow, they were very sluggish, they were very inefficient. But when the plague hit, and you no longer had those people to row, they realized they needed to elevate that ship. And what you get is the caravel. It is a ship much in the design of the Islamic dhow, but much larger and fortified and heavier, able to handle the big seas like the large Venetian galleys. Now, the advantage here is that it's not an advantage, it's much slower, but it can carry a massive amount of load with very few crew members. which is perfect when you don't have enough people. But what happens when then you decide instead of carrying trade goods, you pack the entire ship with food? And if you pack the entire ship with food and water and provisions, you can do more than just travel from port to port. You can sail away for months, up to 3.5, 4 months at a time. And at this moment, this innovation is what allows the launching of this age. Because shortly after this, you are going to see the Portuguese starting to slowly work their way out and work their way down the coast across the 1400s. I mean, they're going to start this in 1419 and then start working their way down until Diaz in 1487 reaches the Cape of Good Hope, and Da Gama in 1497 makes his way all the way around to India. The simple idea being they want to get control of the spice, the cotton, the stone, the silk, the perfumes, the porcelain, the spice trade coming out of the East Indies. But ever since the Mongol Empire fell, the price of these items has skyrocketed because every time it goes through the different hands of a different ruler, it's taxed, and it is extremely expensive to get things from China or the East Indies now to Europe. And if you can cut out those middlemen, the profits are huge. And Portugal, a small, insignificant coastal kingdom, will quickly rise to be one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the entire world. That's how profitable it was. That's how much Europeans were willing to pay for this. Of course, the story does not end there, because quickly, once they realize the opportunities, people start setting off all over the world. The discovery of America, the exploration of South America, the finding the Northwest and the Southwest Passage across. And quickly, Europeans will get a taste for this and begin this globalized search. And it's not just the Spanish and the Portuguese, the French and the English and the Dutch are all very much engaged in this activity. It gets so intense, and after Diaz gets to the east and Columbus gets to the west, the Spanish and Portuguese have to sit down at the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 and actually draw a line down the middle of the Atlantic just to sort out this debate of who's in power. It's actually brokered by the Pope at the time. And the idea is that everything west of the Treaty of Tordesillas will be controlled by the Spanish. Everything to the east of the Treaty of Tordesillas, my arms may be backwards, will be controlled by the Portuguese. And you see why that settlement is there. Now, of course, we are just 30 years away from the Reformation, and once these people stop becoming Catholic, like the Dutch and the English, maybe they don't have to abide by the Treaty of Tordesillas, and that will complicate things. This is just a primer to get us going. There's much more to be said about the gold and the silver. 20,000 tons of silver coming out of Potosi, a single entity in present-day Bolivia. The trade going through the Philippines with China, etc., etc. Who cares that European kingdoms started sailing big ships? Well, this is the moment where a previously insignificant populace living on a peninsula on the western edge of Asia becomes important in the world. Before the 1490s, the powers of the world were China, Central America, India, and the Middle East. This makes sense. These were the locations where large-scale agriculture first took hold. But as Europeans set forth, they quickly asserted control of global trade and aggressively sought to take advantage of any land or people that could increase their wealth. In so doing, European culture, values, religion, and proto-capitalist sensibilities spread around the world and infected the globe.